Good evening. This is CTV News for Friday, May 26th. I'm Denise Douglas.
And I'm Patricia Vallone. Thank you for joining us this evening. Well, it was a vicious crime that shocked the region. A young man who was recently commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army was killed in what is being investigated as a hate crime. His funeral was held today. Our Byron Scott was there.
The family of Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III arrived at First Baptist Church of Glenarden this morning to do what no parent ever wants to do, bury their child.
Just devastated by the loss of their son.
Reverend Darrell Godlock is the family's pastor.
It's really just the beginning of their new normal, of their son never walking through their doors ever again.
Collins was stabbed to death last Saturday as he waited with friends for an Uber ride on the campus of the University of Maryland. This, police say, is the man who thrust the knife into Collins' chest, 22-year-old Sean Urbanski.
Well, it's just a continued profound sadness since we learned that Lieutenant Collins had been taken from us.
The service was called a celebration of life. There were both tears and light moments as people recall the person they called Richie.
We laughed endlessly together, and he plotted mischievous adventures while I just followed the lead that most likely ended up in a spanking.
I stand before you saying, reiterating once again that Richard was generous, Richard was kind, Richard was honorable, Richard loved the Lord.
Just 2 days before he was killed, Collins was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army. He was scheduled to graduate from Bowie State on Tuesday.
The day of his commissioning ceremony, I vividly remember meeting him for the first time. And what struck me with such great pride was his positive attitude, his vivacious smile, and excitement at being branched Military Intelligence Corps.
Oh, I sing because I'm free.
I began to ask God this question: why Richie? Why this young man? Why now? Why Rick and Don's child? Why Robin's brother?
Outside following the service, the casket was placed in the hearse as a father saluted his son.
One main point, if anything we take today, that we have to stop this hate and we have to love one another. Innocent blood is being shed for no reason, absolutely no reason at all.
The funeral service lasted a little more than an hour and a half. As for the interment, that will happen at a later date in a private ceremony. In Upper Marlboro, Byron Scott, CTV News.
Meantime, Senator Chris Van Hollen paid tribute to him on the floor of the United States Senate.
Second Lieutenant Collins was scheduled to graduate with a Bachelor's of Arts in Business Administration from Bowie State University earlier this week. His future could not have been brighter. Tragically, Second Lieutenant Collins' life was cut short by a horrific act of violence that the FBI is investigating as a hate crime. We must bring the perpetrator of this evil act to justice and directly confront the racism behind it.
And Van Hollen described Collins as, quote, a brave, brilliant, selfless, and kind American hero.
In politics, Governor Larry Hogan speaks out about his reasons for vetoing the Healthy Working Families Act yesterday. The legislation mandated that any company with 15 or more workers offer paid sick leave. But Hogan, who was in favor of extending leave for companies with 50 or more workers, says that the bill is flawed.
If we allowed this legislation to go into effect next January, it would be disastrous to our state economy, and it would make Maryland less competitive in our region. It would kill small businesses and jeopardize thousands of Maryland jobs.
The Maryland Democratic Party says, quote, Marylanders should not have to decide between a paycheck and taking care of themselves. And the group MomsRising.org says Hogan's veto is, quote, a huge disappointment. Well, meantime, sponsors of the vetoed legislation vow to carry on the fight.
And joining us now to discuss this issue is Delegate Luke Clippinger of Baltimore City. And thank you so much for coming out.
Good afternoon.
Well, why don't you briefly explain the difference between the bill that was passed by the General Assembly and the one that the governor had proposed?
The legislation that we passed would have provided 5 days of sick leave to 700,000 Marylanders working at businesses with 15 or more employees. What the governor's bill would have done would have created a completely unfunded tax credit that would have gone to corporations to allow them the possibility to set up sick leave mostly at businesses that have 50 or more employees at any one location. So the big difference would be right off the bat, his would cover places like McDonald's and Subway and maybe even Under Armour, because some of their businesses and some of their stores don't have 50 employees at any one location.
And this was also unpaid leave for those with 15 or fewer
right.
employees?
There would be unpaid leave for 15 or fewer employees with the bill that was passed by the General Assembly.
And Delegate, the governor never voiced support for the bill that passed the General Assembly. Did you expect him to veto this bill, or did you think it might pass without his signature?
I held out hope that it would pass without his signature. He gave some indication that he was thinking carefully about the bill, and I hoped that he would consider letting it become law without his signature. But it still doesn't temper my extreme disappointment that we're going to have to come back and fight over the next 7 months to just ensure that we can override his veto in January.
And do you think you have the votes to override it?
I believe we have the votes to override it. We're going to make sure that we have each and every one of the 29 votes we need in the Senate and 85 votes that we need in the House.
And the bill expected to go into effect January 1st, 2018. Now, if the veto is overridden, will that affect that date?
So it would be over, if we override the veto, it would go into effect immediately. And since we would be overriding the veto sometime in January, it would be probably the difference between 2 or 3 weeks.
So you're talking about perhaps the end of January of 2018 when this would take effect?
If we override the veto. I should say when we override the veto.
All right. Paid sick leave has obviously been a very popular issue among Maryland residents. Do the Democrats plan to use this in the upcoming election? This is, with the assumption that the governor is going to run again. Are you hoping to use this in political ways?
Well, I think that it's an issue that a lot of people care about, and that when you're doing something that genuinely will help 700,000 people not have to choose between getting better and taking care of their families, I think that's the kind of issue that hits people where they live. And truly, I think that kind of the politics speak for themselves here. This is a solid bill that's going to help a lot of people, and I'm going to be proud to vote to override it in January.
Thank you, Delegate, for sharing with us, and we'll definitely be keeping an eye on your efforts upcoming in January as well. As mentioned, the General Assembly is expected to try and override the veto when the 2018 session begins in January. A bill that focuses on reforming the liquor board will become law, but without the governor's signature. In a letter to the leadership in Annapolis, Larry Hogan expressed concern that under the legislation, authority will be taken from him and given to the county executive to appoint members to the liquor board. Earlier this year, several people on the board were indicted in a pay-for-play scheme. In light of that, more state oversight is needed to guard against corruption, Hogan says, adding that he is allowing the bill to go forward without his signature because of other positive reforms found in it.